Well, I just got a notification that this is being live streamed, so
There
I
we
guess
go.
whatever
There we
you're
go,
doing
Mark.
is working.
Yep, I think we've connected. I want to welcome everyone. Welcome you, Mark, to another edition of Why We Do What We Do, which was the interview series that we started here at Marsy's Law for All, where we highlight the incredible work done by victims' rights advocates all across the country, people who have been helpful to the victims' rights movement, and many of whom have been helpful to the Marsy's Law movement all across the country. You were helpful to Marsy's Law and victims' rights in the state of California, where Marsy's Law actually was first passed. I want to welcome Marc Klaas to the Marsy's Law interview series right now. Mark, thank you so much for joining us. Mark is a nationally known victims' rights advocate. The work you've done has been absolutely incredible. You've become a great child advocate. You continue to help parents of kidnapped children and victims' families all across the country. You started a foundation called the KlaasKids Foundation. And the people in the victims' rights movement, especially in Marsy's Law, continue to be in awe of what you do. The reason we started this series is because typically when we worked with victims' rights advocates, we saw that the people who are committed to the movement have personal stories that inspired them to get into the victims' rights movement and the victims' rights space. And it's why we call it Why We Do What We Do. Sadly enough, a lot of the inspiration for people in this movement come from very tragic stories, and yours is no exception. Mark, you were part of a story that gripped the nation almost 28 years ago to this day. The story of your daughter, Polly, and Polly's murder was featured all over the country on shows like 2020 and America's Most Wanted, from Oprah Winfrey to the Phil Donahue show at the time. And the way that you conducted yourself and how resolute and sturdy you have been since then is absolutely incredible. I want to ask you, Mark, to take yourself back 28 years ago, as difficult as that is. You were living in California at the time. You owned a successful Hertz rent-a-car franchise in San Francisco. I think it was based out of the Fairmont Hotel, you were telling me.
Mm-hmm, that's correct.
And you had a beautiful little girl named Polly Klaas, who was 12 years old in 1993. Can you first, before we get into exactly what happened, tell us all a little bit about your daughter, Polly?
Well, sure. I think the first great day in my life was January 3rd, 1981, which was the day that Polly was born. I did want to be a father very much, and I was highly anticipating her birth, but it just took my breath away. I mean, the minute that I saw her, the minute that I held her, created something in me that I think only parents can understand, just the unconditional love that one has for one's child. And it was just a pleasure from that point on, watching her grow up and watching her develop. And, there were roadblocks in the way. Polly's mother and I divorced when she was around 2 years old, and that caused some years of difficulty. But her mother was always good about giving me custody, and so we had a very good relationship. I spoke to Polly almost daily. I volunteered at her school as a teacher's assistant. I taught her how to swim, how to ride a bike. We were working on baseball because she wanted to play baseball with the boys. She lit up a room. I mean, so many parents will say that. Most recently, Gabby Petito's father has been saying that, but she just changed the environment wherever she was once she started coming into her own. She had a big, bright, beautiful smile. She worked very hard to overcome her inherent shyness. She unfortunately moved around often, so she wasn't able to develop a lot of close relationships with her girlfriends, but finally she was in a position where that was happening as well. When Polly was in 7th grade, she had many years of musical training, first with the piano, then with the clarinet. She had a lot of girlfriends that she surrounded herself with. They played a lot of goofy games. The only thing I really have left of Polly's is besides mementos, obviously, but it is a 45-minute audio tape that she did with a couple of her girlfriends, where they did a fake TV show, and it's really kind of hilarious. She was kind of I could see where she was going to be kind of a naughty little girl, and some of the directions she was headed. But it was a pleasure to watch her. It was a pleasure to be with her. It enhanced my life. It made everything better. And gosh, I just wish it could have continued.
And I want to take you to October 1st then of 1993.
Mm-hmm.
In a little town called, I think it's Petaluma, California.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a town that was, even, I think when former President Reagan filmed his Morning in America video, it was filmed in Petaluma, California, beautiful
Mm-hmm.
town. And Polly at that point had a sleepover, slumber party with a couple of her friends, and it was a Friday night. Tell us from your perspective, what happened on October 1st of 1993, that Friday night that changed your life forever.
Yeah, indeed. Well, it started out as a normal, regular day, as all days do. And I spoke to Polly at 6:26 p.m. I know that from the logs now. We spoke for about 10 or 15 minutes, really not about too much. I believe she was coming to visit us the next day. And the last thing I said to Polly was, "I love you." And she said, "Daddy, I love you too." And then later that night at 11:30 that evening, we got a phone call from Polly's estranged stepfather. And my wife, Violet, answered the call. And she just said, "No, no, no," and pushed the phone away from her as I was waking up and observing this. And she said, "Tell Mark." And I got the phone, and he said, "Polly's been kidnapped. A stranger came into the house and tied up her girlfriends and stole her." And I said, "Well, I'm coming right up." And he said, "Don't do that. The police don't want a distraught father trampling evidence." So I spent the rest of that evening, number one, confirming that Polly had been kidnapped. Number two, contacting the FBI, feeling that they might be able to get involved in some way. I knew that they had been involved in the Lindbergh kidnapping 60 years previously. And then we had a visit from the local police. They were doing a welfare visit, they said. I suspect they were probably looking to see if Polly was in the house, but I really appreciated all that. And when about 6 o'clock in the morning came around, we had the radio on, and the local news station, KGO, I think it was, announced that Polly Klaas had been kidnapped from Petaluma, California. And that kind of drove it home in ways that nothing else had. So I realized then that I had to make a phone call, or make several phone calls to members of my family, so that they wouldn't hear about this on the TV or on the radio. And it was just so difficult. I mean, one after another, that the shining star in our family, the only grandchild at that time, I believe, the only child from my generation at that time. And it was just absolutely devastating. My mother cried, my sister gasped, my other sister, the last person I called, said, "Don't do anything until I get there." She drove across the bay to my house, and then she, Violet, and I drove up to Petaluma to engage the case, is what we did. And we didn't return home for the next 2 months, the entirety of the search for Polly.
And so when you went first to Petaluma and you met with the police and you met with the FBI,
Mm-hmm.
And you were telling me you're still in touch with some of the FBI personnel and the FBI agent that was assigned to the case,
Mm-hmm.
that you still to this day, just as recently as a week ago, this past week, had lunch with them, you were telling me, and how incredibly helpful they were. But could you take us through that when you say the search and for 2 months, to give people an understanding? This was probably even to this day, the biggest search in the history of the country. It was conducted starting in October, went a couple of months. And tell us a little bit about the search and how the search ended in December of 1993.
Sure. Well, when I got up to Petaluma, in fact, the FBI investigator, the special agent, was a fellow named Eddie Fryer. Came to my house for lunch 3 days ago, 2 or 3 days ago. And he was the first person that I really spoke to from law enforcement in the case. I'd spoken to him the evening before. He told me he was headed to Petaluma. And when we got up to Petaluma, it was really a surrealistic scene, because there were satellite trucks, network satellite trucks parked all around her block, and there were probably miles of cable strewn along the street that were connecting the trucks to the reporters, to the broadcast studios back in the Bay Area. And there were yellow crime scene tape up around Polly's house. And there were cops and there were FBI agents, I'm assuming that's who they were, walking around Polly's property. And the one thing that really struck me is that I had been told that the kidnapper had a beard. And as I looked around at the looky-loos and the various people that were connected there, and even some of the police, everybody seemed to have a beard. And it just kind of freaked me out. It's like, is this guy here? Is the person that did this here? And it turned out he wasn't. But I introduced myself to the FBI and to the Petaluma police, and they apparently were trying to do something very different. They were trying to work in teams together to bring Polly home in the investigation, which is a little different than things had normally been done up until that time. Generally, the FBI would come into a case and take over the case and treat the local authorities almost as their clerks. But they didn't do that. But they explained some things to me right up front that I found very, very helpful. And I think that these are things that are probably done more and more these days. But they told me that they would be looking at me very closely, because non-custodial parents were most often involved in these kinds of disappearances. They told me that any relevant case facts I would hear from them before I would ever hear it on TV. And I was given a liaison with both agencies, somebody that I could go directly to whenever I needed to do that. One of them was Eddie Fryer, the ex-special agent that was here the other night, and the other one was a fellow named Mike Meese. They were really two of the lead investigators on the case, and those doors remained open throughout the entire time. And as our relationship broke down, I felt that their whole job was to find my daughter, and that every day they didn't find her was a day that they were not doing their job. And, you know, that plays very deeply into your psyche at a certain point. One of the things that happened to me early on was I had a dream that Polly was lashed to a tree in a forest very near us here. And I made that dream known, and I asked people to come and help me search for my daughter about a week in. First, we got the people at my wife's real estate office. We had probably 50 or 60 people come in. It was during Fleet Week. Some of the sailors that were involved in Fleet Week in San Francisco came up, and they helped us. They helped us organize the search, and one of them particularly had experience in search and rescue. So his name was Brad Dennis. Brad became very helpful, and we started putting out search parties. We started doing grid searches. It was very organized, but it was also against law enforcement protocol. And they got very, very angry. They threatened jail time to anybody that interfered in the investigation. We explained to them that we weren't interfering with the investigation. We were taking a burden off of their shoulders, that we could hopefully professionally conduct this search and maybe turn up evidence, hopefully turn up Polly, and bring the whole thing home. I had first thought that this was going to be a 3-day adventure. I thought that we would get her back and then we would have a scrapbook full of newspaper articles and we could all be in wonderment for years to come. But I was naive. I didn't understand the nature of good and bad, I guess, is what I didn't understood. And that's a dynamic that played out then over the course of the next couple of months until the truth revealed itself.
And you didn't realize, nor would you have any reason to realize at the time, but now you do, there were over 4,000 people that helped search for Polly. And you were telling me that that I think it was Eddie Fryer who had told you that they had received and were trying to, as you were trying to get to the bottom of things, and you were wondering if the FBI was doing the job, the FBI had received close to 60,000 tips that they were trying to sort through as they were trying to conduct this search for over 2 months.
So that meant that they had to follow up on 60,000 bad leads.
Yeah, and as it turned out, and the enormity of the search and the breadth of the search, you know, as you were telling me, was really unprecedented. And to this day, in this country, this kind of a search. Now, after a couple of months, and you say the truth was revealed, tell us how that happened, and what the truth was.
Well, sure. I mean, I'd been called into Petaluma Police Department several times throughout. I was called in for a polygraph not long after Polly was kidnapped. There were other meetings where they wanted to update me and let me know what was going on, as they promised they would. But generally, that meant nothing was going on at all. But then near the end of November, things really started heating up. I mean, it was absolutely brutal. Reporters would find dog bones in the street and say maybe this was Polly's remains. It was just absolutely one of the worst things that I've ever experienced. But I knew, because of the promise that the PD made to me, that if that was true, I would have heard it from them first. But finally, and I believe it was on the 28th of November, they asked Polly's mom and I to come in. We arrived separately. She arrived before I did. I was escorted into the police chief's office, where there was a Petaluma police captain, an FBI special agent, and my ex-wife, Eve. And they told us they had made an arrest. They went in a little bit into how they made this arrest. It was a homeowner that had found the crime scene and put two and two together with an incident that had occurred on her property on the night that Polly was kidnapped. And they were able to pretty quickly determine that the individual, a character named Richard Allen Davis, was responsible for Polly's kidnapping. And they were able to do that because there had been the incident that I mentioned on the property. Two deputies had come to intervene on the evening of October 1st, when this character had driven his vehicle into a ditch on a private property. And the homeowner said, "You got to get this guy out of here. I don't like this. This isn't good." They reluctantly came and did that, but they did get his name. They got nothing else. They were unaware that a kidnapping had occurred. And so they showed us a picture. They showed us a picture and said, "Do you know these guys? Do you know this person?" And it was a bad Polaroid. We both looked at it. I'm sure they were studying our faces very carefully, but neither of us had any idea who he was. And then they started telling us who he was. And he is an individual that had been diagnosed as a sexually sadistic psychopath back in the 70s. He was somebody that had 2 kidnapping convictions under his belt. He had been released from prison only 3 months previously for his second kidnapping. He had a job when he got out of prison that was paying him close to $18 an hour, which was an enormous salary back in 1993. And they told us that we had to get ready for the idea that Polly was probably dead, which did not sit well with me. I mean, it almost became physical between me and those 2 police officers at that time. And I stormed out and I said some very choice and unprofessional words to them and phrases to them. And then they called us back in 3 or 4 days later. And it was exactly the same scenario. I walked into the room, but this time the police captain was crying, the FBI agent was crying, and Polly's mom, Eve, was crying. And that was it. We learned what had happened to Polly. The whole world quickly learned what had happened to Polly, that somebody who had absolutely no business being on the street had kidnapped her, had raped her, and had murdered her within about a 1 to 2 hour span.
And that must have been an absolute inconceivable nightmare, even though you had been searching for 2 months to finally hear that. And like you had described to me, when you walked into that room and you saw those tears, you knew what was about to be revealed.
You know, it's kind of funny, Peter, because I didn't cry when I heard that. What I did is I said I needed to tell my family, and so we both told our families. They were brought in, and everybody else seemed to be crying. And then we let the people at the search center know what had happened, and then I could tell how devastated they were. And before it appeared on TV, we climbed into a couple of cars and we went back to our condominium 30 miles south of Petaluma for the first time in 65 days. And it was only there that my emotions caught up with the knowledge that had been shared. And I ultimately had to be held down because I would have destroyed my house. It was just maybe the most excruciating evening that I've ever spent in my life. It was just so horrible. And I'm so glad that I was surrounded by people who loved me and protected me and cared for me.
Just a complete unspeakable shock. And then a couple of years later, during the pendency of the trial ultimately began, and you described to me that you actually rented an apartment near the courthouse so you could be there every single day, and you lived there for 4 months in an apartment and went to the trial and he was ultimately convicted on June 18th of 1996 and was also sentenced. The jury also returned a verdict of in the penalty phase, a verdict of death. You were telling me how important it was to feel like you had a seat at the table as a member of the victim's family, and how great the district attorney's office was in including you and notifying you, and how great the victim witness advocates were. And it was really uplifting to hear how much of a team member they made you and kept you the entire time, because we all know that the criminal justice system sometimes can be tough when the victim is trying to have a seat, which is why Marsy's Law is so important, to take those rights of victims and to embed them in constitutions throughout the country, and different state constitutions, starting in California. And you were telling me that after the trial, the first thing you did was you spoke to Polly's mom, and you said, and you never went back to the Hertz Rent-A-Car. I should make that note right now. And you never went back to that franchise, and you made a commitment to Polly's mom, and you said, I'm not going to make Polly's death meaningless, and I'm going to commit the rest of my life to advocating for victims. And there were so many things that came out of the platform that you tragically became hoisted upon, but you took that responsibility and you really changed the way that the criminal justice system operated with respect to victims, and in many other facets too. If we could just go through a few of those, the 3 strikes law, computerized database in California. You changed the way law enforcement communication was going to happen on the California Highway Patrol because of the fact that there was only one channel when the All Points Bulletin went out after Polly's death, that all of the channels weren't synced up. So not all law enforcement could hear what was going on. You were very influential in getting the Amber Alert that everyone knows passed. You worked with President Clinton on getting the crime bill passed. Really incredible things that you were a part of all across the law enforcement and victims' rights and criminal justice community. And there was a group of people that came into California in 2008 to pass what is now known as Marsy's Law. And when you and I started talking about Marsy's Law, you said you referred to yourself as just a small cog. Humbly, you said you were a small cog in a large coalition when you were advocating for Marsy's Law. I happen to know that you were very influential and very effective in advocating for Marsy's Law. And you talked about the fact that you participated in press conferences, and one in particular, you met a woman who had to do what you had to do almost 10 years exactly before Polly died. This woman had to bury her daughter, Marsy Nicholas, for whom Marsy's Law is named, and that was Marcella Leach. Can you tell us about the bond that you share with Marcella and how she was an inspiration to you, and how you felt that you talk about almost an obligation to help?
First of all, the woman I had that conversation with about moving forward wasn't Polly's mom, and that's my bad for not making that clear. It's Violet, my wife, that I had been with for 10 years up to that point. But back to Marcella, it's not just Marcella and me. I mean, you've had a lot of people on your show that I know. I mean, we talked about this yesterday, and we all share that same bond. We share that same bond of having to bury our own children because of violence. And in California, that's rather a large community, and it extends all the way up to John Gillis, for goodness sake, who was the victims advocate for the Bush administration. I think John had to bury 2 of his children.
And Colleen Campbell's another one that
Colleen Campbell and Harriet Salerno and Lawanda Hawkins. I mean, there are so many of us in that time period that found ourselves in that situation. And all of these women, it seemed like mostly women, were greatly inspiring to me. And they were like mentors to me. I mean, they would tell me to watch out for this and watch out for that, and to make sure I kept my focus on where it had to be if I wanted to be effective, not to become tangential in my approach to what I was trying to do. And certainly Marcella was one of those. She was kind of a soft-spoken lady, but she was a soft-spoken lady that carried a very big club, and she knew how to use it judiciously. And between the work of all of these people, and I was a small cog in this coalition, we're able to, against all odds, we're able to get Marsy's Law passed in California, which codified victims' rights in the California Constitution for the very first time. And I need to point out here that what we're trying to do is not take the rights away from anybody. I mean, defendants of crime have rights codified in the United States Constitution, where victims aren't even mentioned in the United States Constitution. So our whole goal was equity. Our whole goal was to give ourselves some rights to offset the rights of those individuals who had so tortured and harmed our families. And the idea that Marsy's Law went from what it was, a small law in California, to now really having tentacles going all throughout the United States, and seeing that various legislators and various communities believe that victims do need to have these rights, not taken away from anybody else, but just right so that they have some kind of a seat at the table, is very gratifying all these years later.
And what's really incredible is you mentioned the Bush administration and the Clinton administration, and you really underscore the idea and the notion that not just Marsy's Law, but the victims' rights movement and victims' rights advocacy really transcends politics and transcends any partisan bickering. This is something that has passed, like you said, starting in California, and has gone all around. We've gone through so many states in the Midwest and in the South and in the East. And one of the things that you and I talked about that we need to make sure that we pay attention to is after Polly's death and all of the advocacy that people like yourself did, that resulted in things like the crime bill that you signed, that you were there signing with President Clinton that day, and the Amber Alert and Marsy's Law. We have to make sure that the culture does not change to one that turns away from victims or puts any less emphasis on victims' rights. And especially these days, when it seems like the pendulum might be swinging, it seems like it's even more important these days for advocates like yourself to talk about maintaining a culture throughout the country, not just in each state, that focuses on making sure that victims have that seat at the table, that equity, that level playing field that they should enjoy as a constitutional right. And you talked about the importance someday of maybe having a federal victims' rights amendment, a Marsy's Law in the United States Constitution, so that victims can have that equity that you talked about. Is that something that you feel is a good solution? Is that something that you're going to advocate for?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I've been advocating for a victims' rights amendment to the U.S. Constitution since 1994. It was Senator Feinstein in California, a Democrat, and I believe it was Henry Hyde in the Congress, a stalwart Republican, that were pursuing the victims' rights amendment, and it just couldn't get the traction. It couldn't get the traction now, and I don't know that it would be able to get the traction today to move forward, particularly today, Peter, because things have changed so drastically. You say this pendulum is swinging. I think the pendulum is swung. In California, Marsy's Law is challenged in many ways because of administrative edicts. They are releasing people from prison. First, they said it was because of prison overcrowding. Then they said it was because of COVID. And they recently announced that they were going to release 76,000 people from prison in a wholesale release. How are you going to be able to notify the families of all those victims that these characters are going to get out of prison? You're going to have a situation, many situations, where somebody's going to go to the supermarket and run into their rapist and not even know that he's been allowed out of prison. So yeah, this has to be codified in the United States Constitution. We need the same kinds of protections for victims of crime as we have for the perpetrators of crime. And the fact that that does not exist and has never existed in our country is detrimental to all of us. And it speaks badly to the criminal justice system in the United States. I think we probably have a better system than any place else. I'm not a scholar. I really can't tell you, but anecdotally, I've been to a lot of other places. I've participated in other countries' criminal justice systems, and ours is the best, but a huge shortcoming is the idea that crime victims still don't have a seat at the table. They don't have equity. And so far, the only way we're going to move in that direction is with Marsy's Law until we can eventually get that amendment for the United States Constitution.
Well, like you said, that's a challenging goal. It's a lofty goal, but it is a worthy goal.
Yeah.
And that is something that I know that you're going to continue to advocate for. I look forward to advocating for it right alongside you. And I really, really appreciate your joining us today, sharing your story that I know is tough to tell. I don't care how many years it is. I want to thank you for your continued support and leadership in the victims' rights movement all across the country, Mark. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Peter. It's been a pleasure getting to know you.
Thanks, Mark.
All right.